the land where money talks. Now, sometimes we hear the expression, money talks, and I think we ought to explore that possibility tonight in a fantasy called The Land Where Money Talks. And I ask you to imagine, along with me, that it's the end of a long spring's day here in Boston, and that we go to cash our meager paychecks at one of the many fine banks that grace our city. I suggest the State Street Bank, only because it happens to be the nearest bank to the studio here. But we get there late, and not only is the bank not open, but the after-hours ATM isn't open either. All we find on the ledge there, where the after-hours machine hangs out, is a little vial. And the little vial we recognize, because we're all fantasy fans, it comes from Alice in Wonderland. It says, "Drink me," on it. Just like we knew it would. Well, we're partial to a good storybook, and we're a little dry, and it's been a long day, so we toss it off. It's pleasant tasting, this liquid we imbibe. It's resonant of things like nectar and ambrosia, or any of the other fabled beverages that seemingly are consumed on Olympus, with a slight sort of afterglow of anisette, or something like that. But we enjoy it. It makes us feel warm. And then there's a great rushing around us as we notice we're getting much smaller. Well, we've seen the Walt Disney cartoon of Alice in Wonderland, and we're not frightened. We know it all comes out happily in the end. We relax and wait to enjoy the visions that will doubtless open up to us. And the first vision we see is a tiny door in the base of the State Street Bank. And obviously it's there for people of our height. Our height, I should tell you, at this point is no more than an inch. And that's when we stand on our tippy toes. I would suggest that it's more like half an inch. And we go to the door, it yields to our knock, and we find a long corridor, and we proceed down this long corridor, which is romantically lit with torches set into the sides, and brass holders and bunting is hung up. I should think that would be what a small mousehole would be like in the bank. Bunting for like maybe a Grand Army of the Republic parade maybe 70 years ago. And a faint sound of brass bands playing. And there are pictures up on the wall of the great Americans of past and present. We even see a few bank presidents there. And finally, after we go through a number of doors, past many torches, we get into a giant bin. And this is the bin where the money is kept, the fabled money of the State Street Bank of Boston. Now, those of you who, like me, are fans of the great Uncle Scrooge, you remember Donald Duck's Uncle Scrooge, the famous millionaire duck who every day, you remember Walt Disney comics, who every day swam in his money. He used to dive off a diving board into a massive swimming pool full of cash, mainly hard cash. And after paddling in it happily for a couple of hours, a butler would towel him off, and he'd get his spats back on his big duck's feet, as I recall. Well, this is a bin sort of like Uncle Scrooge's bin, but it has no coinage of any kind. It's all paper money. Now, those of you who had a grandfather who didn't believe in paper money, or indeed in banks, or possibly what he referred to as the germ theory of disease, you may disapprove of finding nothing but greenbacks, as we sometimes call them, in this massive bin. But relax, because a terrific experience is about to unfold for us. Because in the middle of all these greenbacks, of course, is a great American, as you will notice in your wallet. In the middle of all your money is a great American pictured. And in our land, where money talks, these great Americans have a lot to say. And of course their heads are slightly smaller than the full trunks of our bodies, so when we were at our full height, we'd be looking at 6-foot heads. And they all have a lot to say. There's Washington on the $1 bill, and he's complaining about his false teeth. And there's Lincoln on the 5, and he says his wife's crazy. And Hamilton on the 10 and Jackson on the 20. They're going on with a fascinating talk about the vagaries of American history. And Ulysses S. Grant is on the 50, and he points out that many of the books have maligned him, that he was really a very gentle man who rarely drank, and in fact he couldn't stand the sight of blood. He quotes several instances, which are found only in the most obscure books about the period, about how little Grant liked the sight of blood. And it's fascinating listening to those great Americans. There are even those obscure 19th century presidents like, McKinley, I think, who's on the 500. And Grover Cleveland is on the 1,000. And they go on about the turn of the century life that most people seem to be recapturing in fiction today. But the most fascinating of all the talkers is really Franklin, and also Jefferson. Now, poor Jefferson, he's down there, and he's stuck on the 2 spot, as he says. We don't even use it anymore. But he talks on and on about the duality of his position, and he feels a little schizophrenic, and about the $2 bill as a sort of joke in America, supposed to have a lot to do with betting in the old days, and really the dirty joke is about prostitution and the legendary $2 prostitute, who is found in many old and bad jokes. And Jefferson is associated with that. He talks about the liberal position in America being sort of a recapitulation of being on a $2 bill. The duality going off into 2 ways and things. And he and Franklin get into a wonderful talk. Franklin, you'll recall, is on the 100. And the $100 bill and the $2 bill, that's Jefferson. They talk about John Adams, who isn't represented there at all. And they sort of miss him. And Franklin tells a wonderful story. They've all heard it before, but they hear it again, about how one night at the Continental Congress down in Philadelphia, how John Adams and Benjamin Franklin, we looked this up afterwards and it's quite true, had to crawl into bed together in this small room at an inn. Well, apart from the fact they had political differences of monstrous proportions, they had yet more of an odd couple relationship because John Adams despised beyond all things the night air. And Benjamin Franklin was partial to it. Benjamin Franklin wanted to leave the window open, and this made John Adams very nervous because he thought that vile contagion and all sorts of no-neck monsters rode on the night air. And Franklin tells how he kept saying, "Come to bed, John," until finally Adams, who was nervous about the night air and was sure that he would be dead in the morning, did come to bed. And Franklin went on and on about his scientific theories until, he explained, John Adams was sufficiently bored that he went to sleep. And Jefferson says that he too has a story about John Adams. Well, they were great foes, of course, and Jefferson beat him for president the second time John Adams ran. I guess that was in 1800. But towards the end of their lives, they became friends again. This was when they were both terribly old men, and I guess John Adams was living out in Braintree. He was in his 80s or early 90s then. And Jefferson was living down in Monticello, Virginia, the house that he built down there. And when they realized that this 19th century mercantile spirit, and at this point, all the bills in the money bin laugh because they, in so many respects, represent the 19th century mercantile spirit. When both these men realized that the 19th century mercantile spirit was growing up around them, and it had nothing to do with their quarrel, which was an 18th century quarrel, that both Jefferson's liberal beliefs and John Adams' deeply conservative ones were a different quarrel from a different time, and that they were both surrounded by these new men of the 19th century whom they both deplored, well, they made up. And none of us quite believes what Jefferson says next, but we look it up later and it's quite true. That July the 4th, 1826, was the 50th anniversary of the United States, and all over our country bonfires were built, and fireworks set off, and parades were held, and men made speeches. And on that day, a terribly old man in Braintree by the name of John Adams, and a terribly old man in Virginia by the name of Thomas Jefferson, both died that day. And they both sent messages to the other, to the old enemy, saying, "Now you must carry on alone." And Jefferson thinks back to this moment, to the irony of it, and Franklin recalls John Adams down at Philadelphia at the Constitutional Congress, and they all sort of wish that someone had put old John Adams on a good bill so he'd be down there in the State Street Bank with them, and they could have a good talk. Well, at this point, one of our party points out to these great Americans that there's been a new generation growing up in America, one that holds money to be in many respects evil. These men agree. They say, well, yes, money is very evil. We don't have that much use for money. Some of our 19th century presidents over there and the bigger denominations do, but we 18th century folk don't think that highly of it. Someone else says, well, in the black quarter of Chicago in the early 50s, when the great blues songs were being written, these men say, blues? Blues? We never heard of the blues. And we explain to them what the blues are. And he says at one point that the money itself was referred to as dead presidents. It's in a famous song by J.B. Lenoir, I think, that refers to money as so many dead presidents. And they say, well, it's a way to keep our faces in front of the public. And we wouldn't like to be remembered, though, exclusively in terms of greenbacks, but it's not the worst way we can imagine. Well, we ponder on that, but we get to thinking. Here we are surrounded by these great Americans, and we really are just making chit-chat. We've been working entirely anecdotally. And here are these terrific green and white men who are, after all, the founding fathers. And we feel we should ask them some more questions. And we say, well, from your vantage point in the hip pockets of America, and from your vantage point of your personal histories, what is the genius of this great country? Or maybe we should say, what's its sin? What is the moving factor that seems to escape so many of us? We know it exists. We know it's a formidable land, and in our own way, we're deeply patriotic. But we want to know, what is the genius of America? And we look up, and there's a face we've never seen before on the biggest bill of all, the $10,000 bill. And it's the face of Salmon P. Chase. Who is Salmon P. Chase, we asked. Exactly, boomed Salmon P. Chase. And that's the genius of America. Where else could a man by the name of Salmon P. Chase, whom you've never heard of, be on the biggest bill of all. Good night.